Looks like the Crimson King has become more threatening than ever in 10th edition. He's got improved toughness and the ability to hide so he doesn't get shot off the board turn 1. Enormous general purpose sorcery that can get +1 to wound and reroll all hits and wounds very easily. And finally a sweep attack on his melee profile as well, so he can be a threat to hordes. Let's take a look at the datasheet for Magnus the Red in 40k 10th. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Thousand Suns and specifically reviewing the Primarch's new datasheet in the new 40k. Magnus has definitely had a bit of a rough time of it throughout 9th edition, generally just being a little bit overcosted I'd say. Generally I'd say that his datasheet was powerful enough to be a real threat to the enemy army if he could live to survive a few turns to unleash his sorcery and melee. But perhaps one of his biggest issues was he just wasn't really quite tough enough to justify the points cost, and also with the 9th edition terrain rules he could also be directly targeted by heavy guns right from turn 1. Unless you had an absolutely enormous ruin or something with no windows, basically your opponent would usually be able to see him, and that's usually bad news if they've got any long range guns. It's a bit of a blow if you lose basically a fifth of your army straight from the first turn due to enemy shooting. Now though, I think he's looking a lot better, and points pending he is looking good to put on the table. As I'm sure most of you watching will know, Magnus the Red is the Primarch of Sorcery, arcane leader of the Thousand Suns. Certainly flew a bit too close to the sun in the Horus Heresy, with his delving into ancient forbidden lore, ruined the Emperor's Webway project, which caused the Emperor to send the Space Wolves to bring them to justice, which wound up in the burning of Prospero. After that, Magnus didn't really have much choice but to join the Chaos Legions, and the machinations of Tzeentch spread quickly throughout the Legion. He's still active in the 41st millennium though, and is arguably the strongest active Psyker in the galaxy, able to command enormously powerful warp magic. His miniature is generally a fairly popular one from Games Workshop. He was the first plastic Primarch to return to the 41st millennium, so it's quite a big deal when he came out. Currently it's an expensive one though, £100, €130 or $170, definitely quite a big investment. At least he usually does tend to be a big powerful model with some serious abilities on the go. Should take up a fair amount of points in your army to get it towards 2000 points if that's what you're going for, and is a pretty big and impressive centerpiece model. He was discounted in the recent Christmas Battle Forces in 2022, and as a result you might occasionally see him going a little bit cheaper on eBay. It was quite nice to have a Primarch option at cheaper than normal. In general, I think his model is really quite well received, certainly seems very Tzeentchian and mad. I feel like the most impressive thing about them is those really cool wings, which I think they did an amazing paint job on for the miniature in the box art. Perhaps his head and chest horns though are just a little bit on the weird side, though I guess Tzeentch is all about creativity, embracing the weirdness. If you were looking to pick him up for your Thousand Suns for 10th edition, it's cheaper in various places from third-party stores around the world. The following are linked in the video description below, and they're affiliate links that help support the channel, costing you no more to use them, and they do all save a fair bit over Games Workshop's prices. Element Games in the UK has him for £85, so 15% off. Gap Games in Australia has him 20% off, and in the USA there's either Noble Knight or Amazon, usually around 5 to 10% off there. Thanks to all you guys who do use those links, really does help support the channel. On to the exciting bit though, and here we have the datasheet for Magnus the Red in 10th edition 40k. At time of recording we don't know his points cost yet, so it's going to be interesting to weigh him up versus the other powerful things that can be included in the Thousand Suns army, but we can certainly get an idea as to how he's going to play and the units that he's going to be able to support and interact with. If you field him in your army, he must be your warlord. That can sometimes be relevant for any objectives that need the opponent to slay the warlord, but otherwise isn't really the biggest deal. You can't give him enhancements and things as he's a named character. He's certainly one of the most keyword heavy units in the game. He is a fly monster psyker character with epic hero, demon and Tzeentch. Being fly is particularly relevant, means that he can hop over terrain really quite easily, which is nice, though I guess while his psychic powers do give him a fair bit of damage buffs, having the psychic keyword does mean that certain other weapons in 40k will work a bit better against him. Perhaps one of the nicest things that's lacking from the keywords though is the towering keyword. Previously in 9th edition he couldn't hide behind obscuring terrain because he had 18 wounds. Now the rule for hiding behind ruins is that he needs to not have the towering keyword, so that means that if he's behind a big ruin or something, you won't normally be able to directly shoot him, provided he can hide those rather big wings that do jut out a bit. Otherwise, for datasheet things, he's picked up the chance to explode on death now, which he didn't have before. I guess that happens when you banish him back to the warp. He can deep strike should you want to, though I feel most of the time he'd probably want to start on the board with that great big move and fly. He generates 4 Cabal points towards your Kabbalistic rituals, so quite a chunk there. His leadership 5+, so very good as a Primarch, and objective control 6, so he will be at least some muscle on objectives. Movement wise, he has lost a couple of inches of movement. He only goes 14 inches with fly now, though if he chooses his time flux aura, he can potentially be put back to 16 inches if the extra 2 inches is critical for making a charge or something. Either way though, he's certainly much faster than the rest of the Thousand Suns army, a lot of which is slogging around on foot. Toughness wise, I think is perhaps one of the biggest areas that Magnus has improved. His base stats have been boosted up to Toughness 11 and a 2+ save. I feel like Toughness 11 is perhaps a relative durability gain given that he was Toughness 7 before. A fair few other Toughness 7 things went to either Toughness 9 or Toughness 10, so I think he's improved better than most there. The 2+ save is also very relevant, and again perhaps more so in 10th edition than 9th as well. The AP in the game just generally seems to have been toned down a bit. He'll get a 3+ save against AP -1 now, again not something that he had before. Basically the upshot of the change I think is that small arms like heavy bolters and bolt rifles could actually take a surprising chunk out of him. They were wounding on 5s and pushed him to saving on 4s, now they're really just not going to be effective at all, wounding on 6s and saving on 3s. Otherwise for his durability, as mentioned, I think that hiding behind terrain is a really big deal. That's perhaps one of the most important things out of anything, but also he can still get the -1 damage that he had before. He just has to select that on his Crimson King abilities now, so it would mean that you can't use either of those two other thumb rules. I still think it's probably the best of the three though. Having Magnus survive to keep on dealing his damage is probably the biggest thing out of everything, so I'd certainly select that on any turn that is going to take damage. It's quite nice that you get to select that at the start of the battle round now, not just in your command phase, as it means that if the opponent goes first and can strike him somehow, then you can already have this active. Otherwise, he degrades on 6 wounds now, and that goes down to a hit on a 3+, though interestingly enough, because all of his attacks are psychic, he puts himself back to hitting on a 2+ with his Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerer's aura, so he doesn't really degrade too hard. Overall, in terms of durability, basically you are just going to need anti-tank weapons to take him down. You need 144 heavy bolter hits to kill him, which just isn't very feasible, and that's even before -1 damage gets applied. 48 overcharged plasma, going up to 96 if you got -1 damage, and then melter guns and las cannons do significantly better. 17 melters within melter range, or 11 las cannons, again becoming a bit worse if you do choose the -1 damage Crimson King buff. Basically everything that's strength 12 or above, Magnus will have to fear a fair bit, but he does have a few ways of negating damage, such as a stratagem and command point reroll type things. Perhaps the single most reliable way to actually deal damage to him is mortal wounds. They seem pretty much ideally suited to go into Magnus. They don't care about the -1 damage, and they get through his many defensive layers. Overall though, way tougher than he was before, and looks like you can afford to put him on the front line a lot better. In general you kind of need to with these valuable models, as you need to get the value out of them. Next up, we've got Magnus's devastating sorcery. At range he strikes with the gaze of Magnus, 3d3 shots, hitting at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3 at a big 24-inch range. That one's a very generalist profile and also has devastating wounds that'll help punch up against big stuff. He also strikes as well with Tzeentch's Firestorm, d6+3 shots with the blast keyword. That one hits at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2, will definitely help clear some hordes. I'd say those profiles are just kind of okay, but what really makes them good is that he just gets so many buffs to them. The detachment rule for the Thousand Suns gets you to choose which rule your psychic weapons want to have, either lethal hits, sustained hits, or devastating wounds. They're all good buffs. I guess with Magnus specifically, you'd be overlapping the devastating wounds on the gaze of Magnus, but sustained hits seem like an all-around just good benefit if you're unsure. On top of that, he'll also always be +1 to hit and +1 to wound with his Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerer's aura. He does count as being in range of his own one, and he is a Thousand Suns Psyker, so gets that +1 to wound roll, really good on both of those mid-strength weapons. Putting both of his attacks together, though you could split fire if you wanted against more optimal targets, it'd kill around about 14 Termagants, around 7 Space Marine Intercessors, 4 Terminators with a big toughness 5 and 4+ invul, around 12 wounds to a Rhino tank, so should on average kill 1 there, and only really struggling against heavy armor with around about 8 wounds to a Land Raider. This is really quite brutal average numbers. A very strong chance just to absolutely lay waste to a squad before he tries to charge something else, I guess. And he does have a massive stratagem, as we'll see in a second, that allows him to reroll the hit and wound rolls for this, taking everything to the next level. Overall, I think his psychic ranged attacks are still very strong, even if they're not just buckets of mortal wounds now. In combat, he strikes with the Blade of Magnus. Again, this one has the psychic keyword, so again, just like the ranged attacks, will benefit from both the buffs, the detachment special rule for sustained hits, and also the +1 to hit and wound with his own aura, means that he should be wounding most things on 2s most of the time. The strike mode of the Blade of Magnus is still fairly similar. 7 attacks at strength 16, AP 3 and damage 3, it's got devastating wounds, though I think it's really quite helpful that he's picked up a sweep attack now. 14 attacks at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 1, which actually makes him unlikely to get bogged down in hordes now. Again, if we just go for that sustained hits 1 buff, he kills around about 10 termagants, 5 intercessors, 3 or 4 terminators, 16 wounds to a rhino, or around 13 wounds to a land raider. Overall, not too dissimilar damage from his amount of psychic shooting, but I'd say this one's a bit more skewed to be a little bit worse against infantry and a little bit better against heavy vehicles and monsters. Magnus's damage is now truly brutal, I think. Should hopefully get the alpha strike on the enemy with 14-inch move and fly, blast one unit to death with psychic shooting, and then charge something else and deal a hefty amount of wounds to it in melee. Finally, we've got his buffs and command abilities. That +1 to hit and wounds does go out as an aura for nearby psychic attacks, so it could be helpful for other ranged sorcerers who have got their own psychic shooting. Plus, particularly, there's a stratagem called Ensorcelled Infusion that gives Scarab Occult Terminators Strength 5 Inferno Bolters, so he'll make them very, very general purpose if they also have a +1 to hit and wound with those psychic attacks. I guess they could potentially even deep strike down next to him, Magnus flies in, and the Scarabs land nearby, and open up with a massive great big sorcerer's fusillade. Otherwise, his Crimson King rule allows him to pick between 3 different abilities. Impossible Form, the -1 damage one, which I think is the best to be honest, unless your opponent's literally just attacking him with mortal wounds or damage 1 weapons, or just isn't going to be threatening him at all. I'd generally stick with this one. Keeping him alive to do all his good stuff seems absolutely paramount. The +2-inch movement I think would be my next one to pick, gets him up to 16 inches if he's really not going to make the charge otherwise, and could be quite a nice one to have early on if he's not going to be exposed to the brunt of an enemy shooting phase. It could get your entire Thousand Sons army moving just a little bit faster, as it helps out all the units within 6 inches of him and gets them moving towards the midfield. Finally, the last one is kind of fun, but honestly a bit rubbish. This one you declare at the start of the battle round, but it happens in the enemy shooting phase. You select one enemy unit within 24 inches, and you give their ranged attacks the hazardous keyword. I feel like for most units it's really not going to be the biggest deal in the world. Say if you had a tank with 4 guns to fire, he'd be rolling 4 dice on the hazardous chart, and likely not even get 1. Even if he did, that's 3 mortal wounds, and if that was critical somehow, the opponent could even command point reroll it. I guess perhaps theoretically the best use of this could be if your opponent's got a huge infantry squad with a whole bunch of valuable models with say 3 or 4 ranged weapons. That could be kind of horrible for things like Tau Crisis suits maybe, but in absence of such a unit, I feel like this usually isn't going to be the one to go for, and I'd stick with one of the first 2. Overall, Magnus just seems like a very solid all-rounder, as you might expect for a Primarch. Massive ranged psychic shooting, massive melee with his bladed staff, and really quite solid buffs both to himself and to nearby psychers. Otherwise, he can certainly make use of some of the other rules in Index Thousand Sons. The Cabal of Sorcerers rule is perhaps particularly nice to focus on him, as in general a lot of these abilities might be best on the biggest scariest model around. He also chips in 4 Cabal points to allow you to afford some of them. Temporal Surge for the double move would stop him getting melee, but the threat of moving 32 inches in one turn and then potentially firing off all those psychic attacks at something critical could be massive. Might allow him to be in a place where the opponent can't quite reach him to strike back properly as well. The single rerolled save for just 2 Cabal points I think is really quite nice as well. That's going to be big value if you have the chance of tanking a las cannon shot. It's rarely going to be any better value than it is on Magnus. A 0 command point stratagem is absolutely excellent. There's multiple great ones to use on Magnus as we'll see. Doombolt is a bit less Magnus specific, that's just mortal wounds and that's more applied to the enemy army wherever it's most useful. But Twist of Fate I think is very Magnus specific. Remove enemy invuls either versus his ranged attack or his melee. Absolutely enormous, with AP -3 going into a 4+ invul for example, and particularly brutal against things like demons that really rely on them. Overall he's a good focus. I think in general you're not going to be able to use all of these. I think picking the right ones is really going to be key. Perhaps the double move temporal surge thing might be one of the more thinking outside the box things. If you can survive somewhat late in the game, then that's going to be massive for catching up with remnants of the enemy army and stopping them scoring. Otherwise, the Thousand Sons stratagems are very good for him. I feel like Magnus is going to want to eat as many command points as you can throw him. Just the generic stratagems are great. Rerolling a charge is rarely going to have any better value than on Magnus. It's the difference between getting the damage of that ridiculous melee profile or not. Overwatch seems usable enough if you can light up some enemy with some psychic shooting, perhaps particularly if you've got lethal hits active. And melee focused ones like Combat Interrupts or Epic Challenge could be interesting if it makes the difference of his attacks landing usefully or not. The Thousand Sun ones are basically mostly usable by him personally though. In Sorcerer Infusion you put on Scarab Occult Terminators for Strength 5 combi bolters, then Magnus will be able to give them +1 to hit and wound, so they'll be very very nasty. Devastating Sorcery I think might be the single most impressive one for Magnus himself. reroll hit and wound rolls with his psychic shooting attacks. He can already basically upend battle tanks with his psychic might. This is going to take him to the next level against a really tough target. If you need a little bit of a hand getting that range damage to where it needs to be, you can get an extra 9-inch range, which could be big if it makes the difference between reaching a key unit or not. Hopefully one that you can just avoid with his good movement though. Warp Sight is very expensive, but has the potential to ignore line of sight versus one enemy unit. That could be good if you've got lots of psychic shooting and one enemy unit just can't be hit easily. A bit on the pricey side, that one though. And finally, Destined by Fate, I think is going to be a super frustrating one for your opponents. It's yet another way to mitigate damage on Magnus. If he fails one of those 4+ invuls against a high damage attack, just flip it to become damage 0 for 1 command point. Strictly superior to a 1 command point reroll of a save, though it sounds like you can also do that, and potentially even target him with that Kabbalistic Ritual as well. Anti-tank weapons are going to really not enjoy that. 1 failed save becomes damage 0, and 2 other failed saves can be re-rolled to give you a chance to pass another one. Really nice to have on the toughness front. Overall, I feel like the new datasheet for Magnus is looking rather good. Lots of things to like about this one, and I guess the main thing is whether or not he's going to be the right points cost, and how he's going to compete against the rest of the Thousand Sons army when we see how many other things you'd be giving up to bring him. While he has lost a few things though, I feel like he's improved on a number of levels, the toughness being the biggest thing. His range and melee damage though is just fantastically basically anti-everything. He'll happily deal with just about anything that comes his way, whether it's a horde, or an elite infantry, or a tough tank. The big rerolls to his shooting is really nice. The +1 to hit and wound makes him a good synergy piece, and it's just excellent to target with a bunch of those nice Kabbalistic rituals plus stratagems as basically a focal point for the army. In game, I'd probably want to start him on the board rather than deep striking, ideally behind cover if there's somewhere that can keep him safe from the enemy guns if that's relevant, and likely turn 1 fire up either -1 damage or use the movement boost to try and surge nearby Thousand Sons forward. I feel like he's a model that's got massive options depending on the matchup. You could play him very differently, swooping around at massive speed, blasting things with psychic powers, potentially playing a little bit cagey and being in the midst of your army supporting them for a few turns before going his own way, or just literally rush the enemy army as fast as possible if that makes more sense, and just start killing as many units as possible with his psychic might and combat. Pretty cool that he can be trusted just to take down most units, no questions asked. There's not a lot in the game that can happily tank both his psychic and his melee in one turn. Let me know your thoughts on Magnus the Red though. How do you think that his datasheet's shaping up for 10th edition? Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments below and any other synergies I may have missed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.